for me on World AIDS Day, it's always the same for me. It's about remembering those I've loved and those who are no longer here, but also to be really, really hopeful. To know that we have all the tools available to us, so that no other 30-year-old like I was when I was diagnosed can receive a HIV diagnosis, and that's a reason to be so hopeful.
So, welcome to Political Sandbox by Chamber. Thank you so much for coming on to this special episode commemorating World AIDS Day on the 1st of December. So today we're very pleased to be joined by two amazing panellists. First of all, welcome to you both, and thank you for giving up some time this afternoon. Baroness Liz Barker, thank you so much for coming on. New co-chair for the APG for HIV and AIDS as of a couple of days ago, and a long-standing activist and campaigner in this space. Also patron of the Albert Kennedy Trust.
Yep, and Opening Doors.
And also the Liberal Democrat spokesperson in the House of Lords for LGBT, HIV and AIDS, and also voluntary groups.
Yep, well done.
Thank you very much. Welcome. It's good memory. And Ian Green, who obviously needs no introduction, Chief Executive of Terrence Higgins Trust, who supports a huge number of people living with HIV and AIDS in the UK. Previously, 25 years prior to being at THT, working with YMCA.
That's right.
Also worked as the chair of Ealing Hospitals Group, and also cabinet member at Ealing Council for Housing and Adult Services.
Yep, all of that's correct, Ben.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for coming on today for this special episode. So, 1988, if we can remember back to those days, I was 2, that shows my age, but it was the first time that obviously the world was commemorating HIV and AIDS, and 30 years on, Liz, how do you think progress has been made in this area?
Oh, there's been massive progress. If I think back, I left university in 1982. Friends of mine started to get ill, 1983, 84. And the world just turned black. And although there was a tremendous amount of enthusiasm within the community, big, high-profile fundraising events and stuff like that, it was still a very, very difficult time, and there was no hope at that point, and that was the biggest problem of all, that and the sort of stigma of fear. And so when World AIDS Day came around and the ribbons came around, and we somehow had something around which to sort of anchor our year, I suppose. Because it was a time to be visible, a time to have events, a time to come together in solidarity with one another, and I think that was the big thing then. These days, all these years on, it seems that every year we have something new, something good to reflect back on in the year. This year, clearly, it's going to be injections. Is the latest bit of good news, but from 1996 onwards, from the introduction of the protease inhibitors, the fact that people were no longer going to die, they were going to live. Every year there has been something new to genuinely celebrate, and that's what it feels like to me now.
Thank you. And Ian, obviously with Terrence Higgins Trust's Big 40 coming up next year to commemorate the passing of Terry and the reason for the charity being set up in the first place, and 40 years ago this year where they discovered HIV. I mean, what would you say that Terry would think now, looking back over the last 40 years of progress?
I think that quite a lot, and I think he'll be astounded by the amount of progress we've seen in actually a fairly short period of time. Like Liz said, that those early days of the epidemic were really very dark. I was 23 in 1988, exploring my sexuality and getting to know what life was like as a young gay man, and suddenly to hear about this strange disease and to get to know people who were suddenly becoming unwell was really, really petrifying. And there was this sense of pervading fear over young people exploring what it is to be adults in a time of this, really significant concern around this new virus. We've made so many massive steps forward in that time. The fact that I was diagnosed with HIV in 1996, I was told then I would have 8 years left to live. I've now got a normal life expectancy, and really importantly that because of the medication I take, I can't pass the virus on to my HIV negative husband. And so for many years I was so petrified of being this vector of disease, but to know that liberation of not being able to pass the virus on is so important. So much has changed. There's still things that we need to do, and stigma is one of the things that hasn't shifted enough yet.
Important. And clearly this year, and remembering back to the early part of this year when Russell T Davies' It's a Sin came out, there's plenty in my age group and younger that have no memory of those really dark years. I mean, we've seen the horrific adverts that were posted out, some of the horrible comments that were made, the stigma and issues that were impacting the community during those years when you were obviously campaigning in those formative years. Thinking about what we can learn now and how we communicate back to those younger generations about how not to replicate the mistakes of the past. I mean, what are you thinking now we can end up doing to remind people of the issues that happened during that era?
Yeah, I mean, It's a Sin really did have a massive impact in reminding those of us who are of a certain age that what it was like back then.
I was Jill.
And to know that there were people like Liz who walked as allies alongside people who became so very, very ill is just a stark reminder to all of us of how important, particularly women, were in the response to HIV in those early days. But also to have a real sense of an understanding of the community that actually then sort of galvanised around, and that was the reason that Terrence Higgins Trust was formed. It was Terry's partner Rupert and his friend Martin who said, we've got to do something. We can't just sit back and let this happen. So I think it's about making sure that we remember the reasons why that there was that initial response, but also to celebrate the fact that that journey hasn't yet over, but we've got much to be hopeful for.
And of course there's 105,000 people that are living with HIV in the UK at the moment, and the pandemic has exposed a large number of barriers to those services. So Liz, what are those barriers and how would you suggest we overcome some of those?
Well, I think the barriers are the same ones as they were way back then. Ignorance. 6,000 people have the virus but don't know they've got it, and they don't know where to go and get tested and all of that. Stigma within communities, I think, and families stops people from going to get tested and all of that. And in all the 40 years that things have progressed, and they really have progressed so far, and at such a rate, those two basic things remain the biggest barriers of all, and they manifest themselves in different ways. I think one other thing that I would say, and it doesn't often get talked about in events like this, when HIV and AIDS happened, as it did back in the 80s, a whole bunch of people, young men, suddenly found themselves in health services, and they were very bolshy and they met a very sort of traditional and quite patriarchal system. And I said, oh, hello, we're not having this. And they began themselves, and partly sometimes out of Dallas Buyers Club type desperation, to become patient advocates. And actually they made a huge difference to provision of health services for everybody. And that's, I'm never going to be a Pollyanna about HIV. I don't believe you go looking for silver linings, but that was an incidental benefit which our community brought to health food services in general. And actually I think a lot of that is continuing to pay dividends, not least during the present pandemic as well, because there's a lot of patient involvement in the management of that.
So we've got World AIDS Day. The government's about to publish, or is to publish today, the HIV action plan. So what are we hoping for from that action plan? Ian?
So, the action plan has been informed by the work of the Independent HIV Commission that Terrence Higgins Trust, the National AIDS Trust and Elton John AIDS Foundation were sponsoring. And one of the key elements that the recommendations that came out of the Commission's work, which is we hope will be seen within the action plan, and Liz has already mentioned the importance of testing, and that is the introduction of opt-out testing in high prevalence areas, so that when blood is drawn in an accident emergency department, a test for HIV is automatic unless somebody says, actually, I don't want it. And we know that works. That in maternity services, all mums it's automatic that they get a HIV test unless they opt out. Very few opt out. And because of that, we've virtually eliminated mother to baby transmission of HIV in this country. So it works in real time. And as the numbers of people who are undiagnosed get smaller, the importance of not just targeting those groups that are more likely to be impacted by HIV, but everyone who has been sexually active is going to be so very important. And so testing for me is one of the key elements that I want to see within the action plan, but additional funding needs to go along with that as well. You can't have an action plan that is just about a different way of working. That's important, but you also need additional resource to really make sure that we get to the end in new HIV transmissions by 2030.
So funding and implementation, isn't it? It's about that.
And leadership. And we need the Secretary of State and government to demonstrate real leadership and commitment.
Yeah.
And that's really key.
Well, we've got the Health and Care Bill coming through as well, and clearly the NHS will be working very closely with local authorities to think about HIV, think about the wider community of people accessing sexual health services as well. I mean, it's about to go into the House of Lords, Liz. I mean, are you hoping that the government may combine its efforts in the HIV action plan into the Health and Care Bill, do you think?
I'd like to think so. I live in hope, because I think that the key thing that we have to do is to make sure that first of all, that there is good and robust health information, particularly in schools. I think that's the first thing. Yeah. And the second thing is that we have to recognise that people of colour and women have not been having as successful treatment as other groups have. And until everybody's safe, nobody's safe. And so I think that the routes that work very well for the main group of people who, which we tend to think about when we're talking about HIV/AIDS, that's fine, but we've got to make sure that all of those community initiatives that enable us to get to those other minority groups are not forgotten, really not forgotten.
Yeah, and of course with the financial pressures that are made on community groups, with your other hat on in voluntary services, the pressures are obviously still there and are going to be more apparent again.
Yeah, they are, and the voluntary sector has really struggled, I mean, particularly during the pandemic, but they are a very key part of delivery of services, particularly to minority groups.
And Ian, you were talking about access to sexual health services as well. I mean, clearly the pandemic has thrown access to healthcare services up in the air, and in some parts, digitisation and access to digital services is making a real difference to various communities, and in other ways it's completely destroyed those typical routes into those services. So, I mean, from the pandemic, ask a question about the positives here. I mean, are there things that worked well during the pandemic that you think you want to keep hold of and embed within the system post-pandemic?
So I think that the fact that self-testing and self-sampling has now been something that it's been normalised. I think that's really positive, and so that many people actually now will prefer to get a sexual health screening or a HIV test in the comfort of their own home. That's really important. But I think it's really important that for many people, actually accessing services in more traditional ways is still really important. So you've got to get the balance right between digital services and face-to-face services, but also, like Liz was saying, in terms of the wealth of experience that community groups, particularly women's groups and black-led groups, have in reaching out to communities that they really understand well. Let's not forget that they need to be resourced in order to make sure that outreach service is of top quality and reaching the right people.
And talking about that access to resources, clearly, obviously, uncapped PrEP is now rolled out into many areas, but the funding challenges still remain in various different communities, not just from the access to the PrEP, but I'm talking about the whole service around the individual, the mental health services that might be provided if you do get a diagnosis outside. How do we, ultimately the question is for the Treasury, but how do we find the money in order to help these local authorities which are struggling in the provision of sexual health services?
Well, my big hope is that the effect of the pandemic will be that we will not continue to do stuff just because we've always done it. A different area of interest for me has been women's access to abortion services, and telemedicine has been remarkably efficient and has led to savings. I think it's a service a bit like HIV, where the delivery mechanisms are all so fragmented that a lot of money gets wasted, and I would hope that what we might be able to do is to begin to build 2 or 3 different models of services with different routes of access into those services, built very much with patients telling us who they, what works for them. Because for some people, doing it remotely will be absolutely brilliant, and for other people, no, it won't. And I think at the moment, with the whole of the health service is going to have to rethink its way around. And I think we could make some better use of existing resources, not the whole story, but there's got to be something in that, I think.
Yeah, I'm not wishing to preempt the outcome of the upcoming report by the HIV and AIDS APBG, but obviously the BME community have got particular issues surrounding it in terms of access to services. In terms of what you were just talking about just now around that access, the different requirements from the provision of services, etc., for the BME community, are you seeing some consistent issues that need to be raised as part of the ongoing work of the APBG?
Well, yeah, I think the biggest one is that those groups are never in the room, in that sort of Hamilton kind of, they're never in the room where it happens.
Yes.
Never, they might show you, and that I think has got to be the biggest change.
Get them on the table.
In at the bit from the beginning to design the services that they know will work with people in their communities.
Yeah, and that's a consistent issue for the Department of Health as well as also the Government Equalities Office.
Yeah, I mean, there's a fabulous new network of black-led organisations, the One Voices network, focused around HIV and AIDS, which actually is bringing together a number of different organisations. It's really important that whenever we're talking about these sorts of things and issues, they're sitting around the table and they're helping to shape and design really clear, inclusive services.
That's really important. And one of the points you raised earlier on was around innovation, access to new technologies, and obviously the big announcement a couple of weeks ago in respect of the injection providing long-term alternatives to taking a multitude of different pills, etc. So without wishing to sort of get your Mystic Meg crystal ball out here, but what are the sort of next advancements in this area? I mean, this has been a fantastic opportunity to show how life sciences in the UK around the world can make a big difference to people's life chances, etc. But in HIV and AIDS treatment, are there other types of revolutions around the corner from a technological perspective?
I mean, injectables are fantastic, and the fact currently now it's a 2-monthly injection. I'd like to see that, and I think this is coming once every 6 months, an injection, and that will really revolutionise the approach to HIV treatment. Issues around vaccine, there's work taking place. I think that's some way off. But I think that one of the things we've seen through the COVID pandemic, where there's a will, there's a way. And actually to have a focused attention on new approaches and new technologies actually really can have an impact actually within a relatively short period of time. The other fantastic thing around injectables will be injectable PrEP, which is coming soon as well. Again, that will then protect somebody from acquiring HIV up to, say, 3 months after an injection.
And sorry, Liz.
Well, it's just another thing I'd like to throw in. 40 years. For 40 years, the UK has been one of the leading donors internationally. We have been at the forefront of the development of the science and the medicine, and we have amazingly leveraged our money through international donors by leading the way. And I have to say that when they smashed, and they did smash the FCDA budget, at a stroke, they threw away a lot of that goodwill. And let's be clear about this. Much of that work was what informed the COVID vaccine work as well. So we have got to get that money back into that in there and re-establish those relationships and that reputation as being a world leader, because if we don't, we will have lost the most valuable thing that we did these last 40 years. We really will.
We've also got next year the Safe to Be Me conference hosted in London as well. I assume that's the case that you'd be wanting to make at that international conference.
Absolutely, yeah.
So one of the questions that often comes up, particularly from the community, really relates around the speed of access to those new technologies, etc., that we were just talking about there, and getting regulators to approve in a much faster way. And one of those ways is by doing real world studies and bringing in patients into those conversations as well. Have you seen sort of the regulators during the pandemic work closer with patients? Are you seeing any sort of changes in terms of the way that the regulators are working with patient groups?
I've not seen any specific change. All I do know is that the regulatory bodies are very keen to make sure that they are promoting and advocating and engaging with communities. Yeah, but obviously they've got a really important regulatory role, and I wouldn't want to diminish that in any way. Making sure that any new therapeutic intervention is safe and appropriate, is going to work for people. So keeping the bar high, whilst also then looking at making sure that people are engaged and that we speed things up. Getting that balance right is really important.
One of the other things that I hesitate to raise it, because as soon as I do, I'm out of my comfort zone. I sit in Parliament nearly every day listening to how AI is going to have an impact on absolutely every sphere of life. And actually, I think it could be a real force for good in terms of tracking transmission and trying to predict stuff. And if there is an upside to that, then we have to be in at the point at which the ethical framework for that has to be developed.
Completely. As more access to population health-based technologies enables more patients to be found, but you're quite right, the data around that, how we communicate with patients, obviously needs to be thought through.
Yeah.
That's really important. And to bring this back to patients and to people who are living with HIV, but also those that may suspect that they have got HIV, what would your advice be to those individuals?
If people suspect they might have HIV, get tested. Know your status. That's so important, because if you know your status, you can get onto treatment. Treatment means that you can have a normal life expectancy, and also, really importantly, you're then not able to pass the virus on to anybody else. There's a public health imperative as well as an individual health focus to knowing your status. So I would encourage everybody to know their HIV status. It's really, really important. For people living with HIV, actually I saw some worrying data the other day about the number of people who are lost to care. So people who've been diagnosed with HIV but are no longer accessing treatment. And often that might be through a number of different factors, chaotic lifestyles or mental health issues. And it's really important that we have targeted resources to really understand some of the challenges that those people are facing, and to make sure there's almost like an individualised approach to engaging them in care, because that's really, really crucial for their own health, but also for public health as well. But I just want to, the other thing to say in terms of people living with HIV is that, I thought I'd be dead by now, and just to know that I have a normal life expectancy, and actually the fantastic NHS is keeping me healthy and well. And that's something that I'm eternally grateful for when I look at friends in other parts of the world who don't have the good quality access that we do to HIV treatment and care.
And it is so easy, isn't it, to go and get an HIV test if you need.
It's a sin not to have a test, is my simple message. And apart from anything else, if it does turn out to be positive, Well, there are now a community of people that you can go and talk to who will not judge you in any way at all. They'll just be there to support you. So there's no reason not to do it.
Absolutely, absolutely. So last thing to say, and thank you so much for being so open with us today as well, is what's your message to everybody this World AIDS Day?
It ain't over. It ain't over till it's really over. It ain't over for different groups of people around the world, but life is infinitely better than it was all those years ago. And if we keep going, the rate of innovation and change means that we are so close, I think so close, to finally beating this. If we keep going, then everything that's happened in the last 40 years will be worth it.
Such a positive message, Ian.
For me on World AIDS Day, it's always the same for me. It's about remembering those I've loved and those who are no longer here. And as I always do, I name them. So that's Mark, Michael, Stuart and John, who I miss every day. So remembering is really important, but also to be really, really hopeful. To know that we have all the tools available to us, so that no other 30-year-old like I was when I was diagnosed can receive a HIV diagnosis. That's an amazing goal to reach, and actually that we can do that. We have all of the tools available, and that's a reason to be so hopeful.
There's so much hope out there, and to finish on that note, just thank you so much for coming on today on this such important day. Let's hold the government's feet to the fire on the HIV action plan, shall we? And we'll come back in a year's time and hopefully see even more progress. So again, thank you for your time. Looking forward to seeing you next year.
Thanks,
Thank
Ben.
you.
Thank you for watching. To join this conversation, you can find our social media links in the description. Please like or follow us on social media and subscribe to our YouTube channel.